Outa-space, International Arts and Class Struggle podcast. In this week's show, an interview with Eljeer Hawkins on Black Lives Matter, the legacy of the Panthers and art's role in the struggle. Comment and analysis from the space station, and music by Parallax with a song called Elevator. Okay, so today we're joined by Eljeer Hawkins. He's a nurse, actually not a nurse, a surgical technician. He's a revolutionary activist in the Socialist Alternative Group. He's a university sort of speaker on different subjects. He's from New York, in Harlem. And as I know him, quite a sort of positive vibe kind of guy. So hi, Eljeer, how you doing?
Pretty good. How you doing, Rob? Hope
Yeah, cheers, well. Man. Well, that's who I think you are, but who do you think you are?
I'm all those things, plus being a father of two, of a 11-year-old boy, Shia, and a 1-year-old baby girl, Maya.
Cool. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today was the Black Lives Matter movement that's going on in the US. And obviously this struggle is not new, but with the murder of George Floyd, we've had a massive increase, but in this struggle, but also not just in the US, but a reflection across the world. And I wonder if you'd give our listeners, a little bit of an update to where the movement, what phase are we in with this struggle? What's the significance at the moment of what's been going on in the US?
Right. I think we have to start in some ways with 2019. 2019 saw a revolt against neoliberalism around the world, from Hong Kong to Puerto Rico, to on every continent, basically, that rejected what neoliberalism has brought to the international working class, poor and oppressed, poverty, income inequality, violence, and also deep levels of still racism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant racism. So when we think of George Floyd, I think for the United States context, it's also the question of COVID-19, which has taken over 100,000 lives in the United States. And in fact, we're still in the first wave of COVID-19. And then on top of that, we have an economic depression that has thrown millions of working people on the virtual unemployment line. So George Floyd is an amalgamation of all those things. And so when the protests, or many of us would say the rebellion exploded on May 25th, it was a massive rage and anger of a government that could not deal with the pandemic. In fact, denied the pandemic. You have an economic elite that has basically seen their wealth go up in the phase of the pandemic, but also in the phase of this crisis. And then on top of that, like you said, the ever-present issue of racial and law enforcement terror in the United States. So when the rebellion took place, it was an expression, I think, of the total rage of what neoliberalism has brought to the American working class and oppressed.
Okay, I like I think the idea of calling it a rebellion is very much, it raises it to a higher status, if you like, than just, unfortunately, murders by the police and oppression of Black people in the States and worldwide is not a new thing. What's the significance for the Black community in this struggle? What, is it on a higher level for them? Is it something? I mean, you outlined a very good sort of broad base, that it's the social problems that have indicated. But how does the Black community itself, is it a higher level for a struggle for them?
Right. Well, I think once again we have to contextualize that we are 6 years removed from the events in Ferguson, and we're also 5 years removed from the events in Baltimore. Once again, those cases had police violence cases at the center of those rebellions. And so what has emerged, and this is the complication, that the concrete questions have not been resolved. On the higher level, the demands are far more structural than it was during Ferguson in Baltimore. Like, for example, defund the police or disband the police. So we didn't hear that in 2014 and 2015, but we're hearing it now. And that's an indication that people certainly see the ever present influence and role of law enforcement as an impediment on their everyday life, and particularly where their budgets are in the billions of dollars. Here in New York, as an example, $5.9 billion annually is allocated to the NYPD, which is one of the most highly mechanized, militarized, highly greatly influenced military law enforcement forces in the United States. So on one side, the demands have increased, but still we have an issue where how do you take those demands into the working class, into the Black working class among Black youth? Because the Black community is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. It has different consciousness, different levels of mood, different levels of understanding of the role of the police. And I think what's going to be very important is the link between policing and corporate politics and corporate power and capitalism. Because ultimately, if you're not analyzing capitalism, the state of capitalism that we're in, you're not going to fully understand why law enforcement is on the rampage as it is in a number of cities and states, not just against Black people, but against a lot of just ordinary working people who are Black, brown, white, Asian. So that's something that we have to grapple with, and the movement has to grapple with.
That's interesting. I mean, one of the aspects of the struggle that, I mean, I don't know what you think as an American, because is the internationalism, the internationalist response that happens, because often Americans are viewed from afar as very insular place where you think, you know, you have things like the World Series, which none of us can take part in, and things like that, you know, and I often think, oh, bloody Americans, they just think everything's going on there. What's the effect of the international response to what took place? Because all the things talked about with COVID and neoliberalism and the attacks of the working class, this clearly had a resonance everywhere, you know?
Absolutely. It's a continuum of 2019, and COVID-19 cut across that process in a number of countries, certainly. So people had to turn their attention to dealing with the pandemic. But in dealing with the pandemic, it exposed the effects of neoliberal policies when it comes to healthcare and allocation of proper funds to deal with just normal times, regular times, let alone a pandemic that's taken so many lives globally. And so when the rebellion took place, it allowed for the global working class, poor and oppressed to also enter the stage of events. And I think it's been absolutely tremendous. It's been powerful to see we'll talk about this later, but I'll just give a little, hint that to see monuments come down is a powerful thing because people, I think, at their core, do not accept xenophobia. They don't accept the anti-immigrant racism. They don't accept global racism as a byproduct of capitalism. They may not have all the language, but they know that something rotten is happening, and they have entered that event. And that's why we're getting the type of concessions that we are getting from big business, because the global working class has responded in a very positive and powerful way.
Well, you mentioned monuments there, and we will come to that at the end. But monuments and things like this is art, and this podcast is a class struggle and arts podcast, and we bring those two important factors together. So, one of the things that I saw when I watched the struggle, obviously there was all the political things you spoke about, and there's lots of things there. But one of the things I saw was particularly the murals that were created around George Floyd's murder, and also some fantastic photography. And one of the questions I had for you really is, how has art and creativity in its broadest sense being reflected in the movement in the US on this question? Is there anything significant that you've noted on that question?
I think it's an extension of historically, where art, music, song has really been an expression of people's frustration. You know, when slaves would sing, certainly it was about their own spiritual, keeping their own spiritual being alive in the face of catastrophe and violence, but also as a way of sending messages to other slaves on the plantation. And so I raise that to say that it's a bit of, as part of that history where you see the artistic character of a movement raised to a higher level, because the consciousness and the events are demanding people to express themselves in a far more deeper way. So I think the murals that you saw, the photography that you saw, is an outgrowth of people wanting to capture the moment, capture a moment where, for the first time, young people are hitting the streets. You have rap artists producing music that is speaking to the times. And
Mm.
so this has been within the US context, and certainly globally, but in the US context, it has always been a very important feature of developing the struggle, and also helping to raise consciousness as well. Because a lot of people come to politics in different ways. Sometimes it does take a snapshot of a young person screaming with their fists in the air, or it may take a George Floyd mural that really captures not just his likeness, but in fact captures his humanity,
Mm.
right? And so I know there's a number of murals around the world, actually. I think I've seen some in Palestine, in fact. So it's a very important feature of our struggle, actually.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that interests us here on the show is when we discuss it a bit, is how sort of art and culture gets commodified, in the capitalist system, and how they basically, the energy and resources of the working class is where the best creativity often comes from, but we're denied the access to be it, and
Right.
to perform it and to be paid for it quite often. One of the things about this kind of expression that comes out in a movement like right now is it's very hard for them to make money from that.
Right.
But they do. I mean, I think it's very clear that they might take a couple of black artists, they talk about making money, they show them as this is the American dream kind of thing. And so, do you think that a movement like this might affect that kind of understanding about what a singer should do, what a rapper should do, and this kind of thing? Do you think there'll be a reflection in the arts that maybe comes a little bit later than the murals, and other things? Do you think that's something that might take place and worth watching for?
Right. Well, I think corporate America is certainly investing in trying to co-opt and really control the narrative of this moment. They've invested $2 billion into BLM or BLM affiliated, racial justice organizations, and so we've seen cosmetic changes even in Hollywood. Certainly, we know what Me Too did. The Me Too movement did for Hollywood and changing certain things. This is also having an effect in the sense of how they change diversity and inclusion, and we're seeing that. We're seeing products change that were historically, Aunt Your Mama and Uncle Ben rice. Their images are now being stripped off of these things, and so on one side, that has been important as a small victory, but ultimately, they will and they are working overtime to really corral and control the kind of changes, even changes that many people, many activists are not calling for. In fact, it's almost like a distraction away from the key issue of certainly getting a conviction of the killer cops, and also to defund the police, or demobilize the police in communities of color. At the same time, I do think that there will emerge another segment of the arts that will have a much more radical, revolutionary angle, edge to it, that will not go down the corporate road, That's going to be very important. And so if we can sustain our movement and it's strong, then I think it will also open up a space for artists to really rethink and raise their consciousness and rethink the kind of art that they were producing under quote unquote normal times, under the corporate capitalist paradigm of what art is, and say, you know what, I want to do something different. I want to speak to this moment. And I think we will find that. So in every situation, there's the yin and yang process at play.
Yeah, I mean, this morning I think I shared a Nina Simone quote, basically saying that, I won't try and quote it, but basically saying a real artist is involved in the movement,
Right.
and is focused on it. And I think, yeah, it's great to have some victories, to change imagery, to change
Yes,
conceptions. These are all reforms, aren't they?
absolutely.
And we need to win them, and we show that we win them by taking control of the streets after
That's right.
after a rebellion. But the consciousness of the artist needs to kind of grasp that there's a bigger thing here.
That's right.
And that's what I'm kind of looking for. And I think maybe we as things evolve over the next years, or the next months, even, we don't know the pace of things. I might get you back if you start noticing some really interesting artist movements developing, because
Right.
I think that might be something for us to worth following. There
Wow.
is another question I wanted to ask you though. And
Mhm.
that is some of the other stuff I've seen is I particularly saw one image that hit me, and it was images, and it touches on the monument question we were going to come to. It was images of armed black protesters marching in Georgia, I think in Atlanta, marching towards a Confederate statue, a carving actually in a mountain. Quite a powerful image just on its own. Forget about the significance of it. It's not a cheap Confederate statue that gets easily pulled down. This is something of significance. What I saw though, when I saw that image, what popped in my head was the armed Black Panthers of the 60s. So I mean, maybe for some listeners who may not know, give us a little brief understanding of who the Panthers were, and then if you can, do you think we're going to return to this kind of struggle that the Panthers pushed forward, and maybe explain that a little bit for our listeners too?
Right. Well, the birth of the Black Panther Party, certainly everybody begins October 1966, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. But in some ways, the Panthers, or the whole concept of the Panthers, begins in Loudoun County, Alabama, with a project by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, to not just register voters, but to, in fact, to develop a political party that will be independent of the Democratic Party, and fight against and challenge the segregationists of Loudoun County, Alabama. And so the mascot for the segregationists of Alabama was a red rooster. And so this new party that was going to be born from black sharecroppers and tenant farmers, with the assistance of SNCC, their image was a panther, a black panther. And so a black cat can always kill and destroy a red rooster. And so the birth of the Black Panther Party really takes place not in Oakland, but in Loudoun County, Alabama. To go back, in 1965, there were the rebellion of Watts. And that had a profound imprint on the consciousness of the young people in California, and certainly in the urban settings of California. So you have on one side Loudoun County, Alabama, and the Black Panther Party as an alternative political party, and then you have the Watts Rebellion that took place. And so Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, were students at Merritt College. And certainly, I think one of the big differences between this moment and then is that the political consciousness, was on a higher level. There certainly was a debate of what kind of socialism we needed. Did it look like Cuba? Did it look like the Cuban Revolution? Does it look like the Chinese Revolution of 1949? Will it have the imprint of the anti-colonial struggle in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean? Will it look like the Russian Revolution of 1917? So those are kind of conversations that were taking place. There was no debate around socialism, but there was a debate of what type of socialism. And so, that's something that's very significant about the Panthers. Certainly, everybody had the imagery and the optics of the guns,
Mm.
of patrolling the community against law enforcement terror. That's absolutely correct. But one thing that they had that I don't see from this new generation that is trying to emulate the Black Panther Party for self-defense, the original name of the Panthers, was the political program. They had a 10-point program that they had that really talked about really capitalist rule and racism at its core. And how do you defeat that? How do you provide the most basic necessities for the Black working class, the poor? And on top of that, also have an analysis that runs deeper than just organizing in the Black community, but of invoking solidarity, coalition with other activists and organizers around the country and in their particular states. And so when we think of the Black Panther Party, as one former Panther said correctly, we were not attacked because we had guns. Because in 1967, the Mudford Bill was passed in the state legislature in California that basically disarmed the Panthers. And interesting enough, the NRA did not defend,
Yeah, that's a surprise.
did not defend the Black Panther Party to maintain their guns. And so, that to me is everybody has that image, but in fact, as he would state, Eddie Conway, who has served over 30 years in state penitentiary as a political prisoner, said that we weren't attacked because of the guns. We were attacked because we were socialists. Actually, we were attacked because we had a political, economic, and social alternative to capitalism and racism. And so he said that's why we were attacked. And so when people have this imagery, it's powerful, it's sexy. Beyonce at the Super Bowl in 2015, I think 2015, 2016, she does her song, and her dancers, and she is in Black Panther type of uniform. That's powerful, and as you said, these Americans, they love their big pageantry and their big events, the Super Bowl, the World Series, the NBA Finals. And so to have that is powerful so the world can see it. But at the core of it, where is the political analysis? Where's the political program? Where's the theory for you to understand when you pick up the gun? That represents something. You're going up against empire. So you better understand politically, socially, and culturally what you're doing at that historical moment. So I think today it's powerful, certainly, but I would say, what's your program? What's your political analysis? How are you raising these demands in the community? Are you getting ordinary working people involved? Because that was a question of the Panthers, that it became so much about the gun and the right to self-defense that they lost connection with ordinary Black workers and youth that supported them, that was their biggest cheerleaders, that saw the survival programs of the free breakfast program and the healthcare programs that they provided, these survival programs that the state and the government wasn't providing. So there's a lot of differences there. There's a lot of questions there.
Yeah, I think the symbol of the gun is, it's very American, but it's not the first time that black men particularly have guns in their hands. It's about what they're defending is what you're saying. And I think that's really interesting, especially you talked about consciousness. And one of the things that come across quite a lot is that, well, okay, so they were talking about socialism. How do we get to that point? How do we get to that point where people start talking about socialism again, or which type of socialism, if you like? And I think one of the problems is, how do we approach organization? How do we approach building? All these things. Now, obviously, there needs to be the movement and the anger and the frustration. Well, I think we can safely say we're in a world which has equal problems, if not more, than the 1960s. And the crisis of capitalism is deeper in many respects. Yes, it's different. The difference is the in-between years that have confused that. But I think we're entering a very revolutionary and counter-revolutionary period, which is what we're starting to touch on here. So one of the things I was interested in, you mentioned the 10-point program of the Panthers, and some of the things like, some of the community activism that they did. Do you think there's a necessity to have a look at the model of the Panther Party, you know, for the whole of the left, about how they approach community politics in general?
I think we're going to have to aim to revitalize the organizations that have been basically dormant for quite a while, that have accepted the neoliberal agenda, who see themselves as junior partners of capital. And I'm thinking about the labor movement as an example. And in the course of this George Floyd event, you saw a small segment of the labor movement begin to speak out, begin to organize, begin to march, say that we will not be complicit in what is happening, challenging the police unions that are used to really to encircle the forces of reaction and hate within the police department, and to defend that. While at the same time, for example, in Seattle, Washington, the police union was kicked out of the labor council with 45,000 votes of union members. And mind you, many of the victims of police violence some of them are the children or the relatives of union members, in fact. So you have this contradictory process taking place. So how do we revitalize? In many ways, they will have to draw out the conclusion that the struggle is not just an economic struggle. It's got to be a struggle against racial oppression, gender and sexuality oppression, that the only way that we can absolutely bring forth the type of justice program that we need to become much more political, but from the standpoint of being independent, being clear of who is the enemy, and not placate and pander to the forces of capitalism. I think also how we take the program and how we take demands into the community and organize in the community is going to be absolutely. I think the Panthers does provide kind of a landscape, but even they were limited in many respects, because they didn't see themselves. They saw themselves as the agents of revolutionary change, and didn't see the working class really as the agents of revolutionary change. And that's a deep problem, theoretically and ideologically and methodologically, of how
so
you organize.
A little bit anarchistic or in their approach.
Right.
That's interesting.
Clandestine, right? Clandestine in their organizing.
Well,
they don't.
Yeah, well, all these things kind of draw to another question. I mean, a lot of artists are accused of being a bit like that.
Right.
You know, they think they're going to produce the image or the picture or the song that's going to change the world, and they're going to be the agents of change. You know, artists get a lot of criticism for this from people in the left. You know, sometimes they are a bit anarchistical, individualistic, all these kind of questions. And then on the other side, there's the labor movement that the artist looks to. And see them dull as dishwater, sitting in a boring meeting, pushing pieces of paper at each other. One of the reasons for this podcast is to bring those two forms together, you know, to make more creativity in the workers' movement, you know, and to say to the artists' movement, hey, that's where you got to organize in the working classes, you know. And just on the Panthers, there is there a particular? How did the Panthers deal with the question of art? Is there anything particular in the way that they came across that?
I mean, it's a legendary, you know, element of the Black Panther Party. Emory Douglas, for many people, he's a landmark artist. He drew and developed the front page of their paper, and in fact, all the work around. And I think there was an exhibit actually around the country. I know here in New York at the Brooklyn Museum. They showed a lot of the artwork from that period, from the Panthers, and a lot of it is his work. And it was important because I think it helped to draw in people. Remember, social media did not exist, you know, at that time, right? There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no this and no that. They were just basically paper. There was still newspapers, you know, that was still in essence the socialist movement. There's historically, globally, you know, the socialist movement has produced papers, broadsheets to be able to discuss and speak to the mass. And so they used the development of the paper, right, as the first intro for people of who the Black Panther Party was. Before they even spoke, people saw the paper. People saw the headline, right? They saw the law enforcement officer as a pig. with a
Yeah.
hat and a baton and a gun. And so that's a powerful imagery to have. And so I think they used it to great effect, in fact. And they also got other artists, to give them support, to stand by them. When certainly we know that artists by themselves will not change the world, but they can play a very important role in transmitting ideas, in helping to facilitate the easy access to those ideas to be digestible to people. And so I think Emory Douglas, and in fact, that whole period, actually, the whole new Black arts period movement that existed in the late 1960s into the 70s, played a tremendous role. Um, you know, uh, Theatrical plays, the arts festivals that actually still happens to this very day, in fact, on July 4th, every July 4th. Maybe not this year because of COVID, but every July 4th, it takes place out in Brooklyn at a big, massive park. So that was part of the life. That was part of the culture. That was part of the language. Gil Scott Heron, the Last Poets, international artists, Miriam Makeba out of South Africa. So it was a groundswell that existed, a newfound understanding of the aesthetic, that really talked about our place in the world, that we do have a history, we do have a contribution to give. And so the Panthers and Henry Douglas is part of that whole movement that's taking place. It's a powerful indication that the people were trying to not just express their humanity, but in fact to re-examine and understand it, and bring it to a contemporary audience. And that's absolutely significant. That's powerful, actually, when our movement can have that element to it. We can add that element to it because that allows us then to think on a global scale. Um,
Yeah, I would say this is one of the parts as we, as we build the idea of needing to raise our collective consciousness to understand what we're fighting for and against. The actual role of the artist, in my opinion, is obvious, is absolutely critical, not only in telling the story, but actually in how we go about thinking about what the world should be like. The release of creativity, is one of the things that working class people can't do in any sphere. And if they are creative, it's used by the capitalist system within their workplace or whatever, to make profits, and it's not necessary to talk about their humanity, which, maybe we need to be thinking about what new forms are coming, because you talked about the paper and stuff like that, and what we're doing today is not new, it's 10 years old, but memes and these kind of things, these are interesting ways that socialists and revolutionaries have to be thinking. So I want to come on to one question at the end, which we'll see how far we go with it. It's a big one for me personally, and that's the question of monuments, because you mentioned at the beginning, and we talked a little bit about the international struggle, and for here, here I'm in Spain, but in London, there was London, in Bristol, there was the pulling down of the statue there and it was really significant. It made huge news. I'm aware that before that was taking place in the US, not in this struggle. You talked about previous struggles, but that was a movement that was developing then. Now, I'm a monument builder as part of my work, and I build left-wing monuments.
right.
But I also am doing one at the moment to the International Brigades. And I know that International Brigades monuments regularly get graffitied and attacked and broken up, and this happens to others as well. So what I wanted to ask you really is what do you think about the significance at the moment with the amount of monuments that are being pulled down, and there's people that go, oh well, it's history, you got to keep it, and then they make a little compromise, oh well, we'll put it in the museum. Is that enough to say, okay, we'll take a few down, we'll keep a load up, and we'll stick them in museums, and then we'll put a little plaque there, and everybody be happy, won't they? What's your feelings on the monument question? Do you have it?
Yeah, I think what has emerged is it's just a visceral reaction to that oppression and to the symbols of oppression. Certainly, we know Germany does not have statues and images of Hitler and the Nazis. And so, in fact, that's like a criminal offense to even raise the specter of Hitler, although there are, the far right forces there in Germany. But still, as a state, they do not condone it and do not have it. And I think that's correct. And certainly, we're talking about a U.S. society that, for many of us, is a joke. Like, I thought the South, Malcolm X would say this, I thought the South lost the war. And you have all these miners' flags and monuments all over the place, in fact. And I think it's correct that they do be taken down. But I think it does deserve a historical education. Like, for example, they took off Gone with the Wind. They took it off TV. Is no longer part of the archive. And I think that's a mistake. Actually, I think it does deserve the type of historical commentary to really lay out, what Gone with the Wind represented. And so what's emerging now is like everything that could be perceived is being torn down. And I think that we have to be careful about, because I think there are valuable lessons in a number of these different processes. But the symbols and monuments, I have no qualms with that. I do think there should be a historical reminder of what that represents. But ultimately, this comes down to the fact that America have never grappled or wrestled with its own history. It tells itself mythologies. It tells itself stories and narratives that are not historically accurate, not historically true. And I think that's where people get so angry. There's a rage because you're lying and you're not telling the full story. You're not telling the truth. And then our kids are given that in school. It's regurgitated over and over again. Your 4th of July, right? Frederick Douglass' famous 1852, 4th of July address. This is not my holiday. I was a slave. I was chattel. I was a commodity to be bought and sold. I was your whipping, post, basically. And so those things, if this process, if this struggle is going to emerge, then we're going to have to tell the full history, the full truth of American history. And I think along with that, then when we think of the symbols, when we think of monuments, then I think that comes better into focus, exactly why they don't deserve to stand, why it took years for Mississippi to take the piece of their flag, of the Confederate flag, off, of the U.S. flag. Why Colston, comes towering down, who's a slave trader. People is all part of that, of reframing and also retelling the story. I said that we're not going to applaud this. We're not going to celebrate this. And why should we? Because we're living under tyranny. We're living under oppression. And that's a symbol of oppression. And I think that gets to the heart of where working people, true, genuine working people consciousness is really at. It's really solidarity. It's really about cooperation at the heart. It's just the system produces us, it socializes us to think in our own terms and not to think in the collective. So I think that's why I was very interested in globally. All the monuments were being brought down. All of them were being challenged. And I think that was a global response. And I think a very powerful response.
Well, excellent. Well, I think we'll leave it at that moment, because we're talking there about history. We're talking there about power. We're talking about the struggle. We're tying it up a little bit. I think we've got another couple of podcasts in together, to really get stuck into some of these issues. So I think we'll leave it just at that stage. I thank you very much for coming on the show, and good luck in the struggle in the States, and good luck in building the solidarity we need internationally. Take care now.
Thank you. Got it. Thank you, brother.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So what do you think then, to that one then, Paul?
Yeah, well, like first reaction is that was dense, lots and lots of information, a fantastic interviewee as always, but that was really impressive. And again, a bit like last time, I feel a little bit underqualified. It's such a there's so much here. You must have felt that during the interview.
Yeah, we're talking to somebody who knows their stuff, who's on the front line as it was, and so yeah. I mean, I think we have to understand when we're doing an interview like with somebody like LJ, it's to be respected, I think is what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, we're kind of on his turf,
Yeah.
But I liked it very much. It was very informative, and I think it's one. Maybe it's the one I really need to go back to a few more times before the next season, and really, because I actually, you couldn't do justice to it with notes. It was just, there was a lot. I think every 5 minutes we were into a new block. You know what I mean? And every block was significantly packed with information. So I need to unpack it in detail. But I've got some notes, and I thought the first thing that stood out to me was when he talked about agents of change. That was the one when I thought, well, not so much the first thing I thought was interesting, it was something where I thought we could contribute something. And agents of change was I think it's something that I should let you talk a little bit about, and then I'll come back, because you must have some thoughts on it.
Well, just on first. I mean, we when we spoke, we talked about the political background to the Black Lives Matter movement, and we sort of, if you like, set the scene of what the situation is in the moment and the struggle at the moment and what that meant. And then, I developed the questions to get on to the relevance of and symbolism of things like the Black Panthers, and I think when you talk about the agents of change point, that was really interesting for me, because the Panthers are definitely seen as they're a symbol. It's a symbol in itself, a symbol of historical struggle. But I think what was very interesting about how he sort of posed them, first of all, before he talked about agents of change, he talked about the importance of the political program that they had, and that the higher consciousness that was around at that time about how to change things. And I thought that was quite a critical thing that we kind of need to say first, and then he talked about the Panthers seeing themselves as a bit of the agents of change, and I found that, and I commented in the interview, I found that interesting, because that for me sort of reflected a bit like how some people think art is, certainly sort of from political ideologies, some anarchists, not all, think that by creating the piece of art, that is enough. So you do your art, man. I paint my mural, or I do something in the streets or some performance. That will change minds, and that will change the future. And I think there's a really interesting question for us here for this podcast on that, because one of the things he did sort of outlay was the question of the workers' movement and the power and the waking up at this very moment in the United States of the labor movement, and therefore the workers' movement, the whole workers' movement, of all colours and races. And therefore, when I asked him about the Panthers, I thought it was very interesting that he mentioned this point, that they thought they were themselves the I don't know, how would you say it, the pinpoint of where change would start to come from, and that way it reflected how I think quite a few artists think about their work, and for me, I think it's a very interesting question that we need to develop, because I don't think it's as simple as just turn to the labour movement, because I do believe that, obviously, and I believe the labour movement is the best agent of change, because it's a unifying format, if you like, for want of a better thing, and doing art towards that is important. But there's this other side of it, where actually doing some sparkling art or some symbolic thing can actually be the trigger, can be the opening of a whole debate. So for me, this idea of art as an agent of change, or groups that see themselves as that, I think it's the territory of this podcast. What do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously the Black Panther movement is fascinating to anybody who's got any kind of sense of social justice, because, of course, America, especially then, it's evidently been a problem in America throughout, but the oppression and the tyranny of racism in America, and a whole generation of young men coming up who are expected to go and fight in wars, by the way, you know what I mean, who are then also asked to tolerate, you know.
Well, that wasn't mentioned, actually, Vietnam and all that, was it? Because I think there was a sort of a revolution, there was a process that went on then that really changed people's opinions. Anyway, I interjected.
Sure. No. But I mean, basically, you know, on the one hand, they're asked to serve, and on the other hand, in their homeland, they're oppressed as some kind of, you know, subclass, which is, of course, sickening and revolting. And the fact that one of the responses to that was the Black Panthers, who were, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I know a smattering about this. To my shame, I don't know enough about this, but they present their aesthetic was paramilitary, wasn't it? And like they sort of presented as a sort of very regimented and uniformed sort of collection, and I think that had, and of course, and I remember, like, didn't Public Enemy very much sort of reinvigorate that to the most startlingly, like, you know, memorable effect. Like, that was, and I think it was Public Enemy and not NWA. They might have both done it, but like, it's just like, I think.
Well, that imagery in lots of art and creative music stuff comes the hard sort of thing. But I think he did mention in the interview a little bit on this question, because I raised this demonstration that I'd seen, you know, where there was an arming, and America's a very armed to the teeth country. But he was talking about a political prisoner that I can't forget the name. People can go back and listen to it. Where he basically said, they didn't want to get to us because we were armed. They didn't want to stop us because we were armed, or they didn't oppose us because we were armed. They opposed us because we were socialists, you know, and we had ideas and a different economic plan, and that they were linking up with maybe, you know, other racial groups on the same sort of question. So I think that was what's interesting. And he talked about the arms thing was about defense, you know, and of course, the idea of the American having its gun, we could talk about the guns and art at some point in the future. I think that'd be a fascinating podcast, guns and art. But he talked about, you know, talked about it being the question of defending the community. And of course, you're allowed to do that in America.
I mean, and there was a nugget I'm going to go to in a minute, which I think he said something. I'll just flag it up quickly. I've got another point to make first. He did say something about the reason they made an excuse of the arming thing, to sort of keep them boxed in. But really, the movement was about X, not Y. But what I wanted to say was, I think there's something about that paramilitary, like, kind of imagery that was sort of used as a presentation. Really, it was like, I think it was like the idea was to sort of just because, I mean, that there would have been this appalling prejudice against black people as being something, and when they presented themselves as being organised and regimented and all completely together, you know, sharp. I think that was an interesting challenge to the white middle America, who had a very lazy, prejudicial and fearful feelings about. Now, the fearful one, interestingly, goes over, but I don't think that was a bad thing. I think that was health. I think that's fair enough, you know, because God knows, black people had to fear the white man at that time, you know. But and the fact that this is links into art, the idea that you've got organisation, regimentation, discipline, and art. And as he says, actually the paramilitary aspect of it and the arms aspect of it was not what you think it was. And I must admit, and tell me if I'm wrong, when you see the Black Panthers doing their stuff, there's no guns in it. show, is there? I think they have some kind of cane or something. That's what my memory is of that. I should do more research. I do apologise to the listener, but basically, but it's regimentation, but there's no sign of.
Well, we also talked about the Panthers in terms of their community work and in terms of how they took up the slack in the black community about the lack of social provision. And then he also talked about Emily Douglas and his artwork in the newspapers and, revolutionary stuff in terms of the art of the day, and in terms of getting out the message, which I think, this is the important thing. I mean, if people, young people listening today and they want to fight against the system, what should they do? Yes, create your art, create the symbolism, create those things. And I think you're dead right. The idea of an organized, strong, powerful force, guns or not, because you could still have that in Britain that didn't have the guns, but actually, if you present yourself as a well-organized, oiled machine that has ideas, to change and to challenge the economic structure of American, for want of a better word, white middle class America, to challenge, it's probably wrong actually, but to challenge that, I think that's the power here, and these are one of the things. I mean, just coming to symbols, we did talk about my favorite subject, the sculpture, the monument subject. Any take on that?
How did you feel about that? Because I mean, this is although we're on his turf, now it's thrown into your turf. Like, you were a man of stone, you were a man of the sculpting.
Man of stone, of rock. You could build yourself on my shoulders,
But basically, and then we talk about tearing statues down, and I thought you must have conflicted feelings about that.
Yeah, well, hopefully I can put in a link to an interview I did for a Marxist newspaper in Greece. Hopefully I'll have an English version of it. I'll put a link into the thing because I was interviewed on this question, and so it could develop it a bit more. I thought about doing a whole podcast, but I thought I was a bit over the top. But I think it's very important that actually the pulling down of these statues, not just recently in in Brighton, in Bristol with the Colston monument, but also the other ones that are covered up, but they were pulled down across the world, but they were being pulled down, the Confederate ones, particularly in the US for the last number of years. And this is a movement. And for me, I think it's all fair game, really. Because I build left-wing ones and I know they're going to get attacked. And the only way that you can guarantee that they're not attacked is if you build community support for them, and if there's anger and if they represent oppression, I think it's all fair game. But I took his point on history. And I think really that it's comes back to this question of agents of change, because I think if you're going to pull down in a spontaneous act, if you're going to pull down a statue in a demonstration, and the spontaneous acts aren't always spontaneous, somebody turns up with the rope, somebody planned that. So yeah, spontaneity. But what we're talking about here is when an individual or a group of individuals can gain the mass audience to do something like that, and it's the right time. I'm all in favour of that. What I would be cautious against is this question of whether that's how you're going to change the world, because pulling down one symbol of oppression is a great victory. How are you going to pull them all down? You can't do it. You saw how the mood in Britain, there was a backlash to it, and you had these fucking idiot thugs guarding Winston Churchill or whatever, and fine. But actually, these are just symbols of oppression. What you need to do is smash oppression itself. And that, I think, in this interview came out really well with LJ. He kept talking about it's capitalism. It's the need of a program. It's the need of ideas. It's the need of unity. And he also talked about solidarity. And I think if you're going to be pulling down the statues, then great. We don't want these representations of oppression. But you need to know that what you're doing is building the movement. And so that's where I really come at the question.
You think there's a danger that pulling down a symbol is tokenistic when profound and meaningful permanent change can maybe suffer because the token has occurred and not the
this
actual
is the fine
core.
line, Paul. This is this is the fine line, because lots of people would say that, yeah, and they would say, wow, and they would say that about art itself, that it's not a major thing, more important is building in the trade unions or blah blah blah. There's some very dogmatic people out there, particularly on the left and whatever. And I would say there's a fine line, because there is a moment when you do pull something down, where you do an adventure, where you do something sparkling. The question is timing. And there's absolutely no question to me that the pulling down of the Colson statue was a revolutionary artistic act, and then rolling it down the street and dumping it in the sea, just as he did, with the slaves on the slave ships. And so there's a beautiful symbology to a symbol of oppression. And I think sometimes you have to deal like with like. It's a bit like with fascism. You try and convince a racist. But if you've got to convince fascists, you don't really try and convince them. You make sure they physically cannot harm you, and if necessary, you remove them. And for me, it's like, I'm not a pacifist in that regard. It's not like, oh God, there's a fascist, I shall sit down with my arms in the air. No, you make sure you got some weapons. That's my opinion. So I think it's a very fine line here about tactics, about what's right for the movement at the time. And I think, with LJ's interview, we got a good glimpse of a very thoughtful man, in my opinion. He's not excitable. I mean, maybe he is.
No, it's very
balanced,
very impressive.
Balanced, thoughtful. This is the kind of stuff we need, I think. And more interviews like that, I hope. Yeah. Okay then, Paul. Well, I'll see you soon. Yeah. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, I've got to get on. But thank you very much.
Yeah, got to cut the cord now. See you later.
Cut the cord. Cheers.
Bye. Okay then, this week's music is by a band called Parallax, and the song is called Elevator. And just a reminder to you, if you are an unsigned artist and have some music or a piece of art that you can send us in audio, then please do so. We'll be happy to play your stuff. Okay, cheers, bye.
Don't
I hope you enjoyed today's show. If you have something to say to us, or even something to play, or just want to find out more about this podcast, then why don't you contact us on outa-space.com. That's outa-space.com. Alternatively, you can join our Facebook group, which is Outa-space Podcast. Okay, you take care now.